अनोखा शहर है ये कराची। 24 घंटे धड़कता है, बेचैन रहता है कल के इंतजार में। हर पल
line, painful times, that's not right. Every time, waxing time, painful times, that's not right. Not this time.
Stella से मिले buttery smooth skin 40 बिना किसी पेन के.
Arms, legs, meat, lips, eyes, peach fuzz gone. Stella से मिले buttery smooth skin. This is what I deserve. Stella से मिले buttery smooth skin. Made for me, made for her.
Good morning. The 79th plenary meeting of the General Assembly is called to order. The Assembly will resume its consideration of Agenda Item 64, entitled Use of the Veto, to hold a debate pursuant to Resolution 76/262 of April 26, 2022, on the situation as to which the veto was cast by two permanent members at the 10,130th meeting of the Security Council on April 7, 2026, under the agenda item entitled The Situation in the Middle East. The documentation under this item is listed in the Journal of the United Nations. I will now make a statement as the President of the General Assembly. Excellencies, thank you for joining this 21st meeting of the Veto Initiative, convened on this occasion in response to vetoes cast on a draft resolution in the Security Council on April 7th pertaining to the Strait of Hormuz. The Veto Initiative was established in 2022 to increase accountability around the glaring misuses of the veto and, by extension, the inability of the Security Council to fulfill its core responsibility to maintain international peace and security. Today's meeting is a direct reflection of that mandate. In light of the Council's failure to support efforts leading to safe and unimpeded passage on the Strait of Hormuz, the General Assembly now has both the opportunity and the responsibility to ensure that the debate on the freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz does not end with the casting of a veto. Member States likewise have the opportunity to speak out on the ongoing conflict and the situation in the Middle East more broadly, to hold the Security Council accountable and, importantly, to remind all parties involved of their obligations under the UN Charter and international law. Because every resolution not passed in the name of peace and security and every violation of international law carries real consequences. Consequences for people on the ground and for the countries and communities affected. And as the past weeks have made clear, in our interconnected world, there is nothing theoretical about compliance with international law. What unfolds in one region echoes across all others, with deep and multi-sistered consequences everywhere. Oil prices have surged by more than 40%, rising to around $100 per barrel, with spikes above $110. Disruptions linked to the conflict have removed up to 1.5 million barrels per day from global supply, driving sharp increases in fuel, transport and broader trade costs. The disruption of fertilizers has exacerbated food insecurity for millions of vulnerable people. The IMF cut its growth outlook for 2026, noting the threat of global recession. The economic repercussions are felt everywhere. For example, as far away as New Zealand, where airlines have been forced to slash services, and the Philippines, which had even declared an energy emergency. Yet while the veto resolution focused on the Strait of Hormuz, what we are witnessing is not a single crisis, but the convergence of multiple overlapping and long-standing fault lines, which did not start on the 28th of February. It includes attacks against civilian and commercial infrastructure, from oil and energy systems to airports to vessels and shipping containers, to most shockingly schools and communities. Attacks that are prohibited under international humanitarian law, which protects civilians. It includes tensions over Iran's nuclear and ballistic missile programs. It includes grave human rights violations, most notably the killing of thousands of peaceful protesters in Iran. It includes the persistent threats, including missile attacks against Israel. It includes the deaths of thousands of civilians, including children, in Iran and Lebanon, as well as missile attacks and casualties across the region, in Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, Jordan, and Iraq. And it includes the diversion of international attention from the ongoing catastrophic humanitarian situation in Gaza, and the need to fully implement Security Council Resolution 2803, as well as from negative developments in the West Bank, where we continue to see intensified settler violence against Palestinians. These cannot be ignored, nor can they be separated. They form the broader context within which this current crisis is unfolding. Now, more than ever, dear colleagues, there is a need to refocus our efforts on diplomacy, on negotiations, and on the peaceful settlement of all disputes in the Middle East, in full accordance with the UN Charter and international law. It is there for a reason. In this regard, I commend all parties who have continued to pursue diplomatic solutions, including those efforts that had helped to broker the initial ceasefire between the United States and Iran, which must be respected by all parties and extended throughout the region, including in Lebanon. Indeed, if the Security Council is unable or unwilling to fulfill its Charter responsibility in the maintenance of international peace and security, then the General Assembly, us, you, must step forward. We must then move from debate to action. I therefore encourage all Member States to put forward concrete, forward-looking solutions, including draft resolutions, that help move beyond the current impasse, not only with regard to the Strait of Hormuz, but across the region as a whole. Knowing what a difficult, fragmented time we live in, and fully aware of what might yet come, we should not reduce diplomatic engagement, but rather seize the opportunity to build on the initial fragile ceasefire, including through the efforts of the newly appointed personal envoy of the Secretary General on the Middle East. History has shown us time and again that pursuing diplomacy and upholding international law remain the only viable path to peace and security and the protection of civilians and human dignity, no matter how hard it may seem. And as I said in the beginning, in an interconnected world, it is in the interest of all of us to stand up and protect the international rules-based order, as the consequences of a crisis anywhere affect us everywhere. I thank you. Before proceeding further, I wish to recall my letter on the time management and speaking times circulated to delegations on January 6, 2026. During this debate, speakers are encouraged to adhere to the time limit of 7 minutes for statements made on behalf of a group of states and 5 minutes for delegations speaking in their national capacity. To assist delegations in managing their time, a countdown clock will be displayed on the screens. I thank you for your cooperation. As a first speaker, I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation, followed by China.
कराची, यहाँ सबकी लाइफ कनेक्शन से चलती है, जैसे दोस्ती का कनेक्शन जो हमेशा टाइम पर काम आता है। सिचुएशन कोई भी हो, कनेक्शन ही काम आते हैं। ये कनेक्शन हमारे लिए बहुत स्पेशल मीनिंग रखता है, इसीलिए इसे स्ट्रॉन्ग बनाना तो बनता है। और जब बात हो कराची के कनेक्शन की, तो टेलीनॉर है ना यार।
Госпожа председатель,
Madam President,
7 апреля
on the
Российская
7th of
Федерация
April, the
проголосовала
Russian
против
Federation
внесенного
voted
Бахрейном,
against
Иорданией,
the draft
Катаром,
submitted by
Кувейтом,
Bahrain, Jordan,
Объединенными
Qatar,
Арабскими
Kuwait, and the
Эмиратами и
United Arab
Саудовской
Emirates
Аравией
and the
проекта
Saudi
резолюции Совета
Arabia, the draft
Безопасности
resolution
в
of the
отношении
United Nations
ситуации
Security
в
Council
Ормузском
on
проливе
the
и
situation in the Strait
прилегающих
of
к нему
Hormuz
водах.
and the waters adjacent to it.
В первую очередь
But first of
хотим
all,
напомнить о
we would like to
принципиальной
recall
позиции
the
России
principal
в
position
отношении
of the Russian
конфликта на Ближнем
Federation with
Востоке.
regard to the conflict in the Middle East. Our country condemns the aggression of the United States and Israel against Iran, which was unleashed in violation of the UN Charter and other norms of international law, and which resulted in a large number of victims, including amongst the civilians. We are committed to the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all, without exception, states of the region, both Iran and the Arabian Peninsula monarchies. For this reason, we consider strikes against civilians and civilian infrastructure to be unacceptable. The leadership of our country undertook the most active efforts possible with a view to preventing them. However, some members of the Security Council prefer to turn a blind eye to the root cause of the escalation of tensions. Unfortunately, this was one of the key shortcomings of the earlier Security Council resolution number 2817. Nonetheless, Russia, understanding the concern of its partners of the GCC countries, abstained during that vote. However, in the draft Security Council resolution on maritime security in the Middle East that we are discussing today, not only was the broad context of the conflict ignored, in it the Security Council was being invited to give a green light to the use of certain protective measures under the pretext of ensuring the safety of navigation. This would have become a carte blanche for the continuation of aggressive actions and further escalation. The removal of references to Chapter 7 of the UN Charter and to the mentioning of all necessary measures did not solve this problem. In addition to this, essentially every paragraph of the draft resolution was replete with confrontational and factually incorrect elements, which is something that we spoke about in detail in the statement we made in explanation of the vote on the 7th of April. The adoption of such a document would only have created an additional pretext for aggressors who were already subjecting Iran's civilian infrastructure and civilians to massive strikes. Enshrining the possibility of using force on the basis of vague criteria, accompanied by an attempt to create the impression of Iran as a sole source of threats to international peace and security, left ample room for interpretation by some states and for legitimizing unlawful and dangerous actions. In the very recent past, we have already seen such an example, and everyone can recall what monstrous consequences the broad interpretation of Security Council Resolution 1973 on Libya, adopted in 2011, led to. Russian Federation could not allow the Security Council to sign up to the legitimization of aggression. For this reason, throughout the entire negotiating process and up to the very last moment, we kept calling on our Arab friends to refrain from advancing this draft resolution. Unfortunately, our Bahraini colleagues and their like-minded partners nevertheless decided to bring the matter to a vote. In that situation, we had no choice but to oppose its adoption. China acted in a similar manner. The events that followed did once again confirmed that our countries, as responsible permanent members of the Security Council, took the right decision. Shortly after the vote on the 7th of April, the establishment of a ceasefire regime between the United States and Iran was announced, and on the 11th of April in Islamabad, direct talks were held between the high-level American and Iranian representatives. We are convinced that preventing short-sighted and ill-considered steps within the Security Council made it possible to safeguard the necessary condition to achieve the first, although minimal and very fragile, agreements, as well as for launching a diplomatic process for a comprehensive settlement. Madam President, the Russian Federation stands for ensuring the freedom of navigation, and not only in the Strait of Hormuz and adjacent waters, but throughout the world ocean. We consider it necessary to seek an end to attacks on the commercial fleet of any states, as well as the opening of corridors for Cuba and Venezuela. This problem must be addressed in a comprehensive manner with the participation of all interested states. We are convinced that such an approach should be fully applied to the current situation in the Middle East as well. Resolving the problem of the Strait of Hormuz, aggravated by the escalatory steps of the American leadership to block maritime communication with Iranian ports, is impossible without eliminating the root causes of the current crisis and without taking into account the opinion of Tehran. At the same time, understanding the concerns of our Arab friends, and Russia, jointly with China, put forward an alternative draft Security Council resolution on the current situation in the Middle East, including in the context of maritime security. This draft is framed in a concise and balanced manner and is aimed at facilitating the search for a negotiated solution, which is currently being pursued with the assistance of a number of countries, including Pakistan. The document is currently in blue at the Security Council table. We believe that at the present moment, the Council should focus precisely on such objective initiatives that are consistent with its mandate to maintain international peace and security, and we count on the support of all members of the Security Council. I thank you.
नसीम बाहर आता है, इन ड्राइव खोलता है, नसीम अपनी ऑफर डालता है और ड्राइवर की तरफ से जबरदस्त मेडन ओवर एक शानदार राइड हाजिर होती है नसीम और वो एक चैंपियन की तरह राइड लेता है अपनी मर्जी की राइड लें
सेंसोडाइन रिपेयर एंड प्रोटेक्ट ये दांत के सेंसिटिव एरियाज पर एक टूथ लाइक प्रोटेक्टिव लेयर फॉर्म करके इसे 3 टाइम्स स्ट्रॉन्गर रिपेयर करता है मेरी रिकमेंडेशन सेंसोडाइन रिपेयर एंड प्रोटेक्ट है
I thank the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of China, followed by Kuwait and the European Union.
Madam President, on April the 7th, China, along with Russia, voted against a draft resolution on the issue of the Strait of Hormuz at the Security Council. As a permanent member of the Security Council, China approaches every vote in the Council with a serious, conscientious, and responsible attitude, and always determines its voting position based on the merits of the issue itself and on whether the adoption of a resolution would genuinely contribute to resolving the issue and achieving peace. China attaches great importance to this draft resolution submitted by Bahrain on behalf of the Gulf states. We fully understand their major concerns. At the same time, the Security Council's actions should be aimed at de-escalation. They must not provide a veneer of legitimacy for unauthorized military operations or grant a license to the use of force, let alone further exacerbate tension and add fuel to the fire, thereby leading to an escalation of the conflict. In exercising its veto on this draft resolution, China has upheld international fairness and justice, defended the purposes and principles of the UN Charter, prevented the conflict from expanding further and the situation from escalating further, and created favorable conditions for achieving a temporary ceasefire and launching dialogue and negotiation. China's vote represents a choice responsible for peace and for the people of the region. It stands on the right side of history and will stand the test of history. President, China does not go along with Iran's attacks on Gulf states. China believes that the passage and safety of a strait used for international navigation should be safeguarded. We call on Iran to take proactive measures to restore normal navigation in the Strait of Hormuz at an early date. Meanwhile, the US's ramped-up military deployment and targeted blockade constitute a dangerous and irresponsible move. The issue of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz is a spillover effect of the conflict in Iran. Only a complete ceasefire can fundamentally create conditions for easing the situation. China welcomes the announcement by the relevant parties that a ceasefire agreement has been reached. We support all efforts conducive to ending the conflict. The U.S.-Iran negotiation in Pakistan marks a step in the right direction toward de-escalation. The current situation has reached a critical juncture between war and peace, and a window of opportunity for peace is opening. The pressing priority is to prevent, by all means, a relapse in fighting and to maintain the momentum of the ceasefire negotiation that did not come easy. This serves the fundamental interests of the people in the region and meets the shared aspirations of the international community. The relevant parties should adhere to the ceasefire agreement, stick to the direction of dialogue and peace talks, stay committed to resolving disputes through political and diplomatic means, and take concrete actions to ease regional tension. The international community should continue to intensify efforts to promote talks for peace and unequivocally oppose any actions that undermine the ceasefire or escalate confrontation. All parties should also earnestly respect Lebanon's sovereignty, security, and territorial integrity and prevent the escalation of the situation in Lebanon from affecting the ceasefire agreement. President, as a sincere friend and strategic partner of the countries in the Middle East, China is following closely the regional situation, upholds an objective and impartial position, and has been engaging in intensive mediation with all parties to actively promote talks for peace. Recently, President Xi Jinping solemnly put forward 4 propositions on safeguarding and promoting peace and stability in the Middle East. Namely, staying committed to the principle of peaceful coexistence, staying committed to the principle of national sovereignty, staying committed to the principle of the international rule of law, and staying committed to a balanced approach to development and security. This demonstrates China's consistent position and active efforts to promote peace and conflicts and advocate for dialogue to resolve differences. It offers a Chinese approach to resolving the crisis and ending the conflict. Guided by the essence of President Xi Jinping's 4 propositions, China stands ready to continue to facilitate de-escalation, promote the improvement of relations among regional countries, and play a constructive role in ultimately achieving enduring peace and stability in the Middle East. Thank you, President.
बस फिर मैंने सोच लिया।
क्या सोच लिया? गुड फॉर एवर कंपेनियन।
यही कि अब मेरे घर में भी स्टाइलिश GFC इन्वर्टर फैंस ही लगेंगे।
वेरी गुड डिसीजन।
GFC इन्वर्टर फैन की एनर्जी एफिशिएंट टेक्नोलॉजी से अब बिजली के बिल में 70% तक कमी। GFC, आपका गुड फॉर एवर कंपेनियन।
GFC,
बेहतरीन पे यकीन।
I thank the distinguished representative of China. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Kuwait, also on behalf of Bahrain, Jordan, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates.
In the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate. Madam President, on behalf of the Kingdom of Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the State of Qatar, the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, and my country, the State of Kuwait, I express our appreciation for holding this meeting pursuant to General Assembly Resolution 76/262, following the initiative led by Liechtenstein with broad support from member states. This initiative reflects the commitment of the international community to transparency and accountability when the Security Council is unable to discharge its responsibilities due to the use of the veto. Madam President, the draft resolution on securing maritime navigation in the Strait of Hormuz was tabled on the 7th of April 2026 as part of a responsible and purposeful collective action aimed at addressing a clear and direct threat to international peace and security, and aimed at safeguarding the freedom of maritime navigation as a shared international interest. This endeavor reflected our country's commitment to act within relevant multilateral frameworks, foremost among them the Security Council, in order for the Council to fulfill its core responsibilities in confronting such threats and unjustified and unlawful practices that target the stability of the region and the global economy. The Kingdom of Bahrain in its capacity as penholder, made diligent efforts during extensive consultations with members of the Security Council that lasted nearly 3 weeks to reach a balanced text that takes into account all concerns, in particular those of the countries of the region. These efforts included extensive consultations and the circulation of 6 successive versions of the draft resolution. The vote was postponed on more than one occasion in an effort to ensure the unity of the Council on this important matter. Several proposals were tabled to find common ground. Nevertheless, the Security Council was unable to discharge its responsibility and adopt the draft resolution, despite the gravity of the existing threat and its direct impact on international peace and security. Madam President, through Security Council Resolution 2817, which was co-sponsored by 136 states, the international community has adopted obligations that are not subject to sundry interpretations or selective implementation. Any failure to implement these obligations or any laxity in enforcing them encourages further violations in blatant defiance of this consensus, and this would be a real test of the credibility of the international system. The illegal measures taken by Iran in the Strait of Hormuz have constituted a direct threat to global energy security and the safety of supply chains. When international maritime routes are threatened, the entire world is affected by the repercussions. They impact the lives of millions in the region and around the world. And it is the global south that bears the greatest burden of such crises. The World Food Programme has estimated that continued disruptions could push up to 45 million additional people into acute food insecurity.
अनोखा शहर है ये कराची। 24 घंटे धड़कता है, बेचैन रहता है कल के इंतजार में, हर पल मोहताज, लेकिन गैरों पे भरोसा, पाई पाई का हिसाब, पर हैं बड़े दिल वाले। जितने अज्जा कराची को कराची बनाते हैं, वैसे ही शान की बिरयानी में है मसालों का परफेक्ट ब्लेंड और जायका। खुद सीधा कुछ उल्टा, जैसा भी है ये शहर हमारा है, तो जियो शान से कराची। कराची में 10 में से 9 लोगों का इंतखाब, शान रेसिपी मिक्सेस।
This is not a new matter. This is a pattern of behavior that we have seen before. Security Council Resolution 552 of 1984 expressed international concern regarding such practices. Madam President, these attacks by the Islamic Republic of Iran have not only targeted shipping lanes, but have also affected civilian facilities and critical infrastructure in clear and blatant violation of international law and international humanitarian law, as well as the rules of freedom of navigation enshrined in the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. Such practices cannot be justified under any pretext, and they are imprescriptible. Rather, they require a firm and responsible international stance. This collective action reflected a necessary response to grave developments that created a direct threat to freedom of maritime navigation and affected the safety and stability of international trade, energy markets, and the supply of food and medicine. The draft resolution also aimed to consolidate relevant principles of international law on freedom of navigation and aim to ensure that waterways are not used as tools of pressure or extortion. The failure by the Security Council to adopt it does not absolve any party of responsibility, but it does send an erroneous message to the peoples of the world that threats to international waterways can occur without a firm collective response by the international body responsible for the maintenance of international peace and security. Madam President, the Gulf region is not distant from the countries of the world. Rather, it lies at the heart of the global economic stability. Its security is an integral part of the security of all states, and its stability is a cornerstone of prosperity for the world as a whole. We are aware of the seriousness of existing threats, and we are committed to safeguarding maritime security and ensuring the continuity of international trade. Our countries, therefore, wish to announce their intention collectively to continue working and coordinating closely with member states with a view to submitting a new draft resolution aimed at securing the freedom of maritime navigation. This effort will be based on a comprehensive, consultative approach that takes into account all concerns, thereby enhancing the prospects of achieving broad international consensus and reaffirming the principles of international law applicable to straits used for international navigation in order to protect freedom of navigation, safeguard maritime security, and ensure full compliance with Security Council resolutions 552 and 2817. At the same time, we affirm that the right of our countries to defend their security and sovereignty remains guaranteed under Article 51 of the Charter of the United Nations to address any ongoing threats. Madam President, the credibility of the international system is measured by its unity and its ability to implement its resolutions on the ground. Today, that credibility stands before a real test. We will continue to uphold our responsibility alongside all those who believe in international law and in the right of peoples to security, stability, and a life of dignity. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Kuwait on behalf of Bahrain, Jordan, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the European Union on behalf of the EU and its member states, followed by Singapore and Iceland.
Thank you, Madam President. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the European Union and its member states. The candidate countries North Macedonia, Montenegro, Albania, Ukraine, the Republic of Moldova and Bosnia and Herzegovina, as well as Andorra and Monaco, aligned themselves with this statement. We regret that despite intense negotiations, the draft resolution proposed by Bahrain on behalf of Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the UAE and Jordan could not be adopted because of the veto exercised by two permanent members of the Security Council, the body bearing the primary responsibility for maintaining peace and security. Freedom of navigation and maritime security in the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most critical maritime routes, are essential for the stability of the Middle East, for global trade, for energy and food security, and for other critical supply chains. As we are witnessing today, disruption to its normal functioning carries far-reaching consequences as the security, economic and humanitarian aspects of the crisis spill far beyond the Gulf region. For example, since the onset of the escalation, fertilizer prices increased by 20 to 35% in Latin America and the Caribbean, and global urea prices are up 50% just as Asia enters its rice planting season. This threatens to reduce harvest globally and could drive up to 45 million additional people, as the previous statement indicated, into acute hunger during 2026. This is a global crisis and the most significant humanitarian supply chain disruption since COVID, comparable to the shock caused by Russia's blockade of the Black Sea and the subsequent grain crisis. Any act that threatens safe and free navigation through the Strait of Hormuz is unacceptable. Maritime security, freedom of navigation, and the right of safe free passage through international straits must be respected in line with international law as reflected in the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. It cannot be conditioned by individual states. The European Union welcomes the ceasefire agreed by the United States and Iran and urges for de-escalation and continued dialogue and full respect of international law by all parties, including the principles of the United Nations Charter and international humanitarian law. We commend Pakistan and other regional partners for their efforts and mediation that contributed to this positive outcome. Madam President, we welcome increased coordination among partners to ensure freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz and to consider appropriate measures once the conditions are met. We also welcome the Secretary General's personal engagement in addressing this crisis, including through the appointment of Jean Arnaud as personal envoy for the Middle East, and express our full support for his mandate, as well as for the UN task force set up with the aim to develop mechanisms designed to meet humanitarian needs in the Strait of Hormuz. We urge all involved to fully respect the ceasefire across the region, including in Lebanon, cease all military operations, and fully ensure freedom of navigation in line with international law, with special urgency on the passage of humanitarian goods. UNSC Resolution 2817 should be fully implemented. All parties must comply with international humanitarian law and protect civilians and civilian infrastructure, UN peacekeepers, and humanitarian personnel. In this context, we further call for an urgent cessation of hostilities in Lebanon, which take a heavy toll on civilians. We hope that the first bilateral meeting in decades between Israel and Lebanon may pave the way to a lasting peace between the two countries. To conclude, Madam President, the European Union will continue to engage with partners in the region to contribute to de-escalation and regional stability. Diplomacy is key to resolving all outstanding issues. European Union's High Representative, Kallas, visited the Gulf countries last week, while the President of the European Council, Costa, concluded his visit to the Gulf region yesterday. Parties should continue engaging in good faith in efforts to reach a sustainable agreement on all areas of concern. We stand ready to contribute to all diplomatic efforts in coordination with partners to reduce tensions and to bring about a lasting solution to end the hostilities, prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon, and put an end to Iran's destabilizing activities, including its ballistic missile program. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the distinguished representative of the European Union on behalf of the EU and its member states. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Singapore, also on behalf of Fiji, Malta and Jamaica.
कराची, यहाँ सबकी लाइफ कनेक्शन से चलती है, जैसे दोस्ती का कनेक्शन, जो हमेशा टाइम पर काम आता है। सिचुएशन कोई भी हो, कनेक्शन ही काम आते हैं। ये कनेक्शन हमारे लिए बहुत स्पेशल मीनिंग रखता है, इसीलिए इसे स्ट्रॉन्ग बनाना तो बनता है। और जब बात हो कराची के कनेक्शन की, तो टेलीनॉर है ना यार।
Madam President, it is my honor to deliver the following statement on behalf of Fiji, Jamaica, Malta, and my own country, Singapore. Our four countries contributed actively to the negotiation, drafting, and conclusion of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS. We remain steadfast stewards of the Convention, committed to upholding it as a legal framework within which all activities in the oceans and seas must be carried out. For small states, the international rule of law is a matter of survival. We therefore have an abiding interest in the faithful implementation of UNCLOS as the constitution for the oceans and in reaffirming its universal and unified character. Madam President, at the outset, we wish to express our gratitude to you for convening this debate on the use of the veto. The membership is gathered here today because the veto was exercised to block a draft resolution concerning the Strait of Hormuz. We are disappointed that there could be no agreement on the adoption of the draft resolution, which would have reaffirmed that all ships and aircraft enjoy the right of transit passage through the strait, which shall not be impeded in accordance with international law as reflected in UNCLOS. The Strait of Hormuz is a strait used for international navigation, through which the right of transit passage applies under UNCLOS. This right is also firmly entrenched in customary international law, and it is therefore binding on all states, regardless of whether they are parties to UNCLOS. Transit passage applies during peacetime and war. This right is not contingent on any license or levy. It is an inherent right of ships and aircraft to traverse without prior authorization. As reflected in Article 44 of UNCLOS, the rule is unequivocal that states bordering such straits shall not hamper or suspend transit passage. There are no exceptions to this inherent right. The right of unimpeded transit passage has been and continues to be of fundamental importance to international maritime trade. When transit passage is disrupted, the consequences reverberate across the global economy through energy markets, supply chains, and increased freight costs. For many small island nations and developing states with import-dependent economies, such disruptions have severe impacts on economic resilience and energy security. It is in the collective interest of the international community to ensure respect for and uphold the right of unimpeded transit passage in the Strait of Hormuz, as well as in all other straits used for international navigation. Madam President, the current situation in the Strait of Hormuz, where transit passage has been impeded, is of great concern. We call on all concerned parties to uphold and respect the right of transit passage, comply with all other applicable obligations under international law, restore safe and unimpeded transit passage in the Strait of Hormuz, and ensure the safety of seafarers and ships. Madam President, please allow me to also make some additional remarks in my national capacity. Singapore had welcomed the announcement of a 2-week ceasefire in the Middle East on the 8th of April 2026. We are encouraged by the steps towards de-escalation and commend the efforts of the mediators, in particular Pakistan. We urge the United States of America and the Islamic Republic of Iran to continue down the path of dialogue and redouble efforts in negotiations that will lead to the permanent end to the conflict and lasting peace and stability in the region. Safe and unimpeded transit passage through the Strait of Hormuz, in accordance with international law and UNCLOS, must be restored. The safety of seafarers and ships must be ensured, and Singapore also endorses the statement to be made later by the Philippines on behalf of ASEAN. Thank you.
Waterverse, the poetry of purity.
Lumpy line, painful times, that's not right every time. Waxing time, painful times, that's not right. Not this time.
Stella से मिले buttery smooth skin 40 बिना किसी पेन के.
Arms, legs, knee, lips, eyes, deserve. Stella Simile, buttery smooth skin. Made for me, made for her.
I thank the distinguished representative of Singapore, also on behalf of Fiji, Malta and Jamaica. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Iceland, also on behalf of Finland and Norway, followed by the Philippines and Liechtenstein.
Madam President, I have the honor to speak on behalf of Finland, Norway and my own country, Iceland. First, allow me to pay tribute to the originators of General Assembly Resolution 76-262. This resolution is proving itself an effective tool for holding to account the permanent members of the Security Council in all circumstances where the veto is used. The Security Council bears primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security. It carries out its duties on behalf of the entire membership. It is entirely right and proper that the permanent five explain their use of a veto and the consequent failure of that council to act in the cause of peace and security. We also remain supportive of the General Assembly, considering its own role in situations where the Council is unable to act. The casting of the veto by China and the Russian Federation at the Council meeting of April 7th prevented the Council once again from taking concerted and decisive action to re-establish peace and security. The resolution aimed to address a key aspect of the conflict in the region, namely the protection of global commons in the shape of the Strait of Hormuz, as a vital international shipping lane, and the responsibility of all parties to refrain from further escalation and cease all attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure in compliance with international law. Freedom of navigation is a cornerstone of the law of the sea and must be upheld. The failure to resolve these issues risks massive damage to the global economy and severe impact on millions of ordinary people, particularly in countries already in a situation of food insecurity. We thank Bahrain and other GCC countries for their attempt to bring all member states on board. The resolution went through a number of iterations and was in its final iteration limited to purely defensive measures and was designed to prevent escalation. The failure of the Council to respond risks widening further the credibility gap when it comes to the Council's role in peace and security. The vetoes cast last week prevent the further development of Resolution 2817, in which the Council condemned any actions or threats aimed at closing, obstructing, or otherwise interfering with international navigation through the Strait of Hormuz. This resolution was supported by a record number, 138 UN member states, including our countries. Madam President, with conflicts escalating in the Middle East region and elsewhere, causing devastating humanitarian consequences for millions, the Security Council must turn a new page. The Security Council needs to be a forum in which the tough positions are resolved, not simply showcased. We support the UN's leadership through the Council and by the Secretary General. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Iceland, also on behalf of Finland and Norway. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Philippines on behalf of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations.
Thank you, Madam President. I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the 11 member states of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations: Brunei Darussalam, Cambodia, Indonesia, the Lao People's Democratic Republic, Malaysia, Myanmar, Singapore, Thailand, Timor-Leste, Vietnam, and my own country, the Philippines. ASEAN expresses deep concern over the developments in the Middle East and their implications for regional and global peace and stability. In the ASEAN Foreign Ministers' Statement of 13 April 2026 on the developments in the Middle East, we welcome the announcement of the 2-week ceasefire between the United States of America and the Islamic Republic of Iran on 8 April 2026, and underscore the importance of its full and effective implementation. We reaffirm the importance of maintaining maritime safety and security and upholding freedom of navigation in and over flight above straits used for international navigation, in accordance with international law, including the 1982 UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, and the relevant standards and recommended practices by the International Civil Aviation Organization and the International Maritime Organization. In this regard, we call for the restoration of the safe, unimpeded, and continuous transit passage of vessels and aircraft in the Strait of Hormuz in line with the 1982 UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, as well as for all parties to ensure the safety of seafarers and ships in accordance with the International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea. We urge the United States of America and the Islamic Republic of Iran to continue negotiations that will lead to the permanent end of the conflict and lasting peace and stability in the region. We commend the efforts of the Islamic Republic of Pakistan and all parties involved for the collaborative efforts in this regard. We call for the full and effective implementation of the ceasefire, aimed at preventing further suffering and loss of lives, ensuring maritime security and freedom of navigation and overflight, especially for merchant, non-combatant vessels and aircraft in accordance with the 1982 UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, minimizing disruption to the flow of energy and essential goods, and mitigating its adverse impact on global economic stability. We urge all parties involved to maintain conducive conditions for the full and effective implementation of the ceasefire, exercising utmost restraint, ceasing all hostilities, acting responsibly, avoiding any acts that may aggravate the situation, and working collectively towards a comprehensive and enduring resolution in accordance with international law, the United Nations Charter, and relevant UN Security Council resolutions. We underscore the importance of maintaining regional peace, stability, and prosperity, upholding international law, and promoting earnest dialogue and diplomacy as the primary means of addressing conflicts and tensions, including the need for a complete and immediate cessation of hostilities across all fronts in the Middle East. We further reaffirm the obligations of all states to resolve their differences through peaceful means, to respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all nations, to protect civilians and civilian infrastructure in armed conflicts, and to ensure the safety and security of UN peacekeepers and humanitarian personnel, in line with international law, the UN Charter, and relevant UN Security Council resolutions. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Philippines on behalf of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Liechtenstein, recalling the time limit of statements for delegations speaking in their national capacity of 5 minutes, followed by Egypt and Japan.
Morning, Madam President. Thank you for convening this assembly in a timely manner after the casting of a veto by the Russian Federation and China on draft resolution 2026/273 proposed by Bahrain on behalf of a group of states in the Security Council. We appreciate the production of a special report by the Council in the presence of both vetoing states at today's meeting, both of which are in line with the provisions of resolution 76262, otherwise known as the Veto Initiative. We look forward to receiving a summary of today's meeting to be sent to the Council for their reflection in line with Resolution 79327. Madam President, the situation regarding the Strait of Hormuz is of significant concern across the world, not simply because of the armed conflict that has led to the situation in and around the strait, but because of the consequences for global shipping and for the transit of vital energy supplies, foodstuffs and fertilizers, and the massive impact on the global economy. The conflict is making life unaffordable for many and will undoubtedly leave the most vulnerable hungry. We appreciated the initiative to bring a resolution addressing the situation in the interests of populations the world over, indeed, of all of us. We also appreciate the efforts by the drafters to listen to Council members with concerns over the text, while this has unfortunately not resulted in a resolution that was able to be adopted by the Council. It is important that measures taken by the Council are commensurate with the threats they are meant to address, including through appropriate temporal and geographical limitations. We also note in this context that the draft did contain some ambiguity, in particular with respect to the chapter under which the Council is deriving its legal authority for the measures contained in the text. A more general problem with respect to the drafting of Council resolutions. We encourage all drafters of such texts to specify under which chapter they intend the Council to act. Madam President, today we find ourselves in a different situation to when the draft was vetoed. Liechtenstein thanks Pakistan and all other states who have worked towards the ceasefire deal between the United States and the Islamic Republic of Iran, and urges for its full and complete implementation and the conclusion of a lasting peace agreement. We note that Israel has announced it will enter talks with Lebanon and urge negotiations in good faith on the basis of the aforementioned ceasefire. We also thank the Secretary General for the nomination of Jean Arnaud as his personal envoy on the Middle East conflict and its consequences, and express our full support for his work. Madam President, this is a situation where the world rightfully expects action by the political organs of the United Nations. We have listened carefully to the comments offered by Kuwait this morning and look forward to further steps to present a resolution echoing also the call that you yourself have made this morning. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Liechtenstein. Now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Egypt, followed by Japan and Austria.
सेंसोडाइन रिपेयर एंड प्रोटेक्ट ये दांत के सेंसिटिव एरियाज पर एक टूथ लाइक प्रोटेक्टिव लेयर फॉर्म करके इसे 3 टाइम्स स्ट्रॉन्गर रिपेयर करता है। मेरी रिकमेंडेशन सेंसोडाइन रिपेयर एंड प्रोटेक्ट है।
जो करे हर मैदान फतेह, वो तबरेज हो तुम। जुड़ी है जिससे लाखों की मुस्कान, वो फरहान हो तुम। जीत का नाम सरसब्ज के सुल्तान हो तुम। सरसब्ज जमीन की जान, फसल की शान।
Madam President of the General Assembly, since the very first day of the conflict in the Middle East and the Arabian Gulf, Egypt has expressed deep concern regarding the dangerous military escalation in the region. It has warned of the looming threat that this escalation poses, namely the expansion of the conflict causing instability and total chaos, thereby endangering regional and international peace and security. In this context, Egypt reiterates its complete rejection of all forms of aggression against the sovereignty and territorial integrity of its sister Arab nations in the Gulf, as well as Jordan and Iraq. We condemn these unacceptable and unjustifiable acts of aggression. We also stress our full solidarity with sister Arab states and our unwavering support for them in the face of any threat to their security and stability. Egypt has therefore co-sponsored Security Council Resolution 2817, adopted by the Council on March 11th. We also stress the need to fully adhere to the UN Charter and international law, including international humanitarian law. This entails completely refraining from targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure, including energy facilities, water desalination plants, and residential areas, as such acts constitute grave violations of international law and pose a direct threat to regional stability. We extend our sincere condolences and deepest sympathies to the families of the innocent civilians who have fallen prey to these violations. Madam President, Egypt emphasizes that there can be no military solution to this crisis. Continued escalation will only lead to further violence, destruction, and human suffering, while simultaneously undermining security and stability. In this context, Cairo has made efforts over the past year to build confidence and foster a conducive environment for resolving any concerns regarding the Iranian nuclear program, including by promoting dialogue, diplomatic solutions, and cooperation with the IAEA. So in close cooperation with Pakistan and Turkey, Egypt engaged in intensive consultations with various regional and international parties throughout the war to ensure de-escalation and prevent the situation from reaching a point of no return, ultimately paving the way for a ceasefire and a comprehensive, sustainable settlement. In the same vein, Egypt welcomes the initial steps taken by the Secretary General to revitalize the United Nations role in addressing this conflict, including his appointment of a personal envoy for this matter. Accordingly, Egypt welcomed the announcement by the US President on April 8 of a 2-week suspension of military operations in the region. This is a positive step toward de-escalation and containing tensions. Egypt stresses that the suspension of military operations by the United States, coupled with a corresponding response from the Iranian side, present a vital opportunity that must be seized to pave the way for negotiations, diplomacy, and constructive dialogue. We welcome the convening of a significant round of negotiations between the United States and Iran on Saturday, April 11, in Pakistan's capital, Islamabad. We look forward to building on the agreements reached during these talks to promote diplomatic solutions that would bring an end to the war through robust and sustainable arrangements. We underscore the need for building upon this step through full adherence to the cessation of military operations and respect for the freedom of international navigation. We stress that Egypt will continue to make every effort in coordination with Pakistan and Turkey to advance this objective. Egypt joins the vast majority of the peoples and governments of the region and the world calling for an urgent end to this war, the losses and damages of which would only multiply were military operations to resume and were diplomacy and dialogue, which are the sole window of hope for us all, to be abandoned. Thank you, Madam President.
Poetry, it is around us. The poetry of clarity. Waterverse, the poetry of purity.
बस फिर मैंने सोच लिया।
क्या सोच लिया गुड फॉर एवर कंपेनियन?
यही कि अब मेरे घर में भी स्टाइलिश GFC इन्वर्टर फैंस ही लगेंगे।
वेरी गुड डिसीजन।
GFC इन्वर्टर फैन की एनर्जी एफिशिएंट टेक्नोलॉजी से अब बिजली के बिल में 70% तक कमी। GFC, आपका गुड फॉर एवर कंपेनियन।
GFC,
बेहतरीन पे यकीन।
I thank the distinguished representative of Egypt. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Japan.
Thank you, Madam President. Achieving peace and order in the Gulf and the entire Middle East is of paramount importance, not only for regional stability, but for global peace and security. In this context, ensuring the safety of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz is indispensable to any meaningful normalization of the situation. Japan has consistently supported diplomatic efforts toward early de-escalation. From this perspective, it is regrettable the Security Council could not play a significant role in stabilizing the situation in the Strait of Hormuz at this juncture. Under these circumstances, Japan expresses its respect and support for the mediation efforts by the parties concerned, particularly the recent US-Iran negotiations held in Islamabad. We hope that such diplomatic endeavors will lead to a positive impact on the normalization of transit through the strait. As a vital artery for global commerce, the strait must remain open and safe for international navigation. Current situation in the Strait of Hormuz has been undermining global food and energy security. Japan underscores that ensuring free and safe passage of the Strait of Hormuz constitutes a vital foundation for global socio-economic stability, particularly for those regions such as Asia and Africa that are most directly vulnerable to disruption. In this regard, Japan welcomes the decision made by the IMO Council on March 19th. We call for the relevant parties to take necessary immediate actions to enable establishment of a framework such as a safe maritime corridor to facilitate the safe evacuation of merchant ships. The disruption of maritime transport not only threatens the well-being of seafarers, but also hinders the integrity and viability of the international maritime system. For our part, Japan recently hosted a summit meeting to call for a new framework called Partnership on Wide Energy and Resource Resilience Asia, Power Asia, to cooperate in emergency responses through financing the procurement of crude oil, petroleum products, and maintaining supply chains in Asia, as well as in structural responses such as establishing stockpiling and release system. In conclusion, we call for further diplomatic efforts by member states to restore safe international navigation through the Strait of Hormuz in accordance with international law, as reaffirmed in Security Council Resolution 2817. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Japan. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Austria, followed by the Islamic Republic of Iran and the United States.
Madam President, Excellencies, colleagues, we gather here today because once again Council action was blocked by the exercise of the veto by 2 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council. Austria regrets that a matter of profound global consequence went unanswered by the Council. Colleagues, even as a landlocked country, Austria is acutely aware of the importance of maritime security and respect for the rule of law at sea. The legal situation is crystal clear. As a strait used for international navigation and connecting 2 parts of the high seas, all ships enjoy the right to continuous and expeditious passage through the Strait of Hormuz, according to Article 38 of UNCLOS, and also according to customary international law. This right cannot be suspended unilaterally and continues to apply in times of armed conflict. The unilateral blockade of or restrictions to freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz have severe consequences for food and energy security across the world, as many have said before. This threatens to destabilize the global economy, and it risks pushing the most vulnerable countries to the brink of famine. Millions will suffer if this situation remains unaddressed. Madam President, any unilateral actions restricting the freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz or other international straits are therefore completely unacceptable. Austria strongly calls for the freedom of navigation through the Strait of Hormuz to be swiftly restored. We welcome the Secretary General's initiative on fertilizer exports as a pragmatic first step. But let us be clear, we welcome it, but pragmatic workarounds are not a substitute for the rule of law. Iran's international obligations remain untouched by such an initiative. Colleagues, let me speak plainly about the wider situation. Iran must never acquire a nuclear weapon. For Austria, which has championed the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons and has worked towards a world and also a region free of nuclear arms for decades, this conviction is not rhetorical. It is a pillar of our foreign policy. And the people of Iran who have endured decades of repression deserve respect of their human rights and their human dignity. But military escalation is not the answer. Austria is gravely concerned by the further erosion of the international order with the UN Charter at its core. In the same vein, indiscriminate attacks by Iran on its neighbors in the Gulf and in the broader region are completely unacceptable and must stop immediately. And this was also expressed by Austria's Foreign Minister Beate Meindl-Reisinger upon her visit to Riyadh only last week. Colleagues, a diplomatic solution is the only way forward. De-escalation and diplomacy are urgently needed. Austria therefore calls on all sides to continue to respect the ceasefire agreed on last week to allow for negotiations. Austria does not simply call for diplomacy and dialogue as a platitude. Federal Chancellor Christian Stocker and our Foreign Minister Beate Meindl-Reisinger have been in constant contact with all partners across the region and with the parties to this conflict. We're grateful to Pakistan and others for their tireless efforts in Islamabad. That those talks did not succeed is a setback, but diplomacy doesn't stop because one round of talks have failed. Vienna has hosted historic negotiations on the Iranian nuclear question before. We stand ready to do so again. Our offer is sincere and our commitment to mediation is unconditional. Colleagues, the only path forward is a peaceful solution. Austria stands ready to do its part to help achieve this goal. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Austria. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran, followed as the new speaking order by Denmark and New Zealand.
In the name of God, the compassionate and merciful, Madam President, before delivering my statement, I would like to express Iran's strong objection and serious concerns regarding the biased and one-sided statement delivered by Your Excellency in the capacity of the President of General Assembly, which by departing from the mandate and institutional responsibilities of that office overlooked the root causes of the situation and made unfounded allegations against a member state. It is a well-established principle grounded in the spirit of the Charter of the United Nations and the rule of procedures of the General Assembly that the holder of this office must exercise a strict impartiality and refrain from adopting positions that could compromise the neutrality and credibility of the General Assembly. Madam President, the vetoes cast by China and Russia were timely, justified, and necessary. During the Council meeting, my delegation made clear that the text was one-sided and ignored the root causes of the crisis, the illegal and savage war of aggression by the United States and Israel against Iran on 28 February. Its adoption would have set a dangerous precedent, eroding the sovereign rights of the coastal states, undermining the UN Charter, and increasing the risk of escalation. Madam President, recent U.S. unlawful actions, including efforts to impose a naval blockade in the Strait of Hormuz, further demonstrate the flawed logic behind the draft. These unlawful measures escalate tensions and threaten both maritime security and international trade. Against this backdrop, I wish to mark the following points. First, the Islamic Republic of Iran, as a responsible state committed to the United Nations Charter and the international law, has consistently upheld freedom of navigation and maritime security in the Persian Gulf, the Strait of Hormuz, and the Gulf of Oman. For decades, Iran has fulfilled its responsibilities in good faith as a coastal state of the Strait of Hormuz, ensuring security and safeguarding freedom of navigation. Iran, in accordance with international law, has implemented necessary and precautionary measures to ensure the safety and security of navigation through the Strait of Hormuz. These measures are designed to facilitate the continuous and safe passage of vessels while preventing the exploitation of this waterway for hostile or military purposes by aggressors and their affiliates. Second, the imposition of the maritime blockade announced by the United States constitutes a grave violation of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Iran. This unlawful action is a flagrant breach of the prohibition on the threat or use of force enshrined in Article 2 and constitutes a clear act of aggression under international law. By seeking to obstruct maritime traffic and from Iranian ports, the United States unlawfully interferes with the exercise of sovereign rights of the Islamic Republic of Iran and infringes upon the rights of the third states on lawful maritime commerce under international law. The United States must bear full responsibility for this internationally wrongful act for any consequences arising therefrom, including the impact on the regional and international peace and security. The realization of principles of freedom of navigation and maritime safety in the Persian Gulf and the Sea of Oman, particularly in the Strait of Hormuz, which lies within the territorial seas of its coastal states, is only possible through full respect for the sovereignty and sovereign rights of those coastal states. As such, sustainable stability in the Strait of Hormuz and in the region can only be achieved through the cessation of aggression and the full respect for Iran's legitimate right and interest. Third, over the past 40 days of the United States and Israeli regime war of aggression against Iran, the aggressors have crossed every legal, moral, and humanitarian boundary. They have violated international humanitarian law and committed war crimes by deliberately and indiscriminately targeting civilian infrastructure, including residential areas, schools, hospitals, healthcare facilities, airports, sport facilities, and cultural and historical sites. Furthermore, the United States utilized military bases and facilities located in the countries of the Persian Gulf region. Evidence indicates that military movement and operational preparation were underway at these bases for the planning, preparation, equipping, and execution of unlawful military attacks against the Islamic Republic of Iran, despite Iran's prior warning that such unlawful actions were being planned. Iran has formally reported this development with supporting documentation to the Security Council and the Secretary General. Fourth, Iran welcomes and supports any diplomatic affairs and credible initiative capable to bringing about the sustainable end to this unlawful and unwarranted war, including all genuine affairs through Pakistan, Turkey, Egypt, and the Kingdom of the Saudi Arabia, as well as affairs by China and Russia. Any viable solution must ensure a definitive and irreversible end to the aggression and establish a just and durable peace grounded in the credible and verifiable guarantee against any recurrence. In this regard, we wish to express our sincere appreciation for the efforts of the government of Pakistan, particularly the Prime Minister and the Chief of the Army Staff, for the constructive mediation and for hosting these important negotiations. Despite our deep mistrust of the United States stemming from its repeated betrayal of diplomacy, we nevertheless entered the negotiation in good faith and remain cautiously optimistic. We believe that should the United States adopt a rational and constructive approach and refrain from advancing demands that are inconsistent with the international law, this negotiation can lead to a meaningful outcome. And finally, we categorically reject an unfounded and politically motivated allegation against my country made in this meeting. These claims lack any legal basis and serve only to divert attention from the realities on the ground, namely the illegal and savage war launched by the United States and Israeli regime against Iran. Some members referred to the Security Council Resolution 2817. Iran's legal position on this resolution have been circulated as a document of the General Assembly and the Security Council. Resolution 2817 disregards the unlawful war of aggression and armed attack by the United States and Israel against Iran, and in ignoring denies Iran inherent rights of self-defense exercised in accordance with Article 51 of the UN Charter. By omitting any reference to the aggressors, the Council fails in its responsibility to maintain international peace and security, and instead by adopting such a politically motivated resolution risks legitimizing further act of aggression. It should be recalled that under international law, the Security Council is bound to exercise its authority in full conformity with purposes and principles of the Charter of the United Nations. Any departure from these fundamental principles undermines the legal validity and moral authority of this decision. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Denmark, followed by New Zealand and Australia.
Madam President, thank you for convening today's debate. It is vital that when the Security Council is silenced by the use of the veto, the United Nations as a whole is not. In this fragile moment for global affairs, the international community, including through the General Assembly, must let its collective voice be heard. Denmark strongly regrets that in the face of mounting escalation across the Middle East, the Security Council was unable to act due to the use of the veto by 2 permanent members. As the primary organ for the maintenance of international peace and security, this was an opportunity missed for a unified and collective response. The conflict in the Middle East has now been going on for more than 6 weeks, causing death and destruction throughout the region. Iran's actions near and around the Strait of Hormuz has led to food shortages, rise in energy prices, and other adverse effects across the world. Global growth, commerce, and development depend on the freedom of navigation. The repercussions for the global economy and, increasingly, for food security, in particular across developing countries, are enormous. As a great maritime nation, Denmark is committed to maritime security, to open sea lanes, and to the safety of all seafarers. Denmark's vote on April 7 reflected our belief in the urgent need to address these developments. We regret that the Council was not able to come together and present a joint solution. Madam President, we welcome the 2-week ceasefire between the United States and Iran and thank Pakistan and all parties involved for facilitating this important agreement. Denmark welcomes all diplomatic efforts to reduce tensions and find a negotiated settlement. A lasting ceasefire is an essential step towards a swift and permanent end to this war. All efforts and negotiations must be resumed in good faith. This conflict, however, is not confined to Iran or its neighbors across the Gulf. This situation in Lebanon, in particular, also risks spiraling out of control and puts at risk the current regional de-escalation. Denmark calls for the inclusion of Lebanon in regional de-escalation efforts and urge all parties to work toward a lasting political solution. It is crucial to protect civilian populations and critical infrastructure across the region. De-escalation and respect for international law, including international humanitarian law, remain as important as ever. These international rules were agreed upon after brutal lessons learned from war and devastation. All parties must keep these lessons in mind and abide by these important legal guardrails. Madam President, many aspects of this conflict have sent shockwaves across the globe. This is particularly true for the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, caused by Iran's actions. This closure is not only a disruption, but a dangerous escalation measured in lives and livelihoods lost. It is vital to ensure freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz. Denmark stands ready, with our international partners, to contribute to this end. We thank the United Kingdom and France for their efforts to advance this vital work. Madam President, in closing, in today's interconnected world, conflict is rarely, if ever, contained to where it began. Its effects ripple across the globe, impacting countries and sectors seemingly far removed. This is the reality we're facing in the Middle East. This too must be the lens through which we find our solutions. We call on all parties to respect Security Council Resolution 2817, and we urge all to respect and abide by the Council's decisions. Denmark remains committed to safeguarding peace, security and stability in the Middle East. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Denmark. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of New Zealand.
President, it is to New Zealand's deep disappointment that we meet again to discuss the use of the veto. New Zealand is a long-standing opponent of the veto. We are a strong supporter of Resolution 76/262 and are disappointed that it has been triggered so frequently. The Security Council's legitimacy lies in its ability to fulfil its responsibility under the UN Charter to maintain international peace and security and to address issues of pressing concern to member states. When a resolution is blocked through the use of the veto, the Council is deprived of that ability and its effectiveness and credibility are undermined. In this instance, 2 permanent members have prevented the Council from supporting an effort to ensure safe and secure navigation through the Strait of Hormuz. The closure of the strait is deeply damaging not only to supply chains, but energy markets and food security, and is causing suffering around the world, especially among the world's most vulnerable. The resolution in question also contained important affirmations of navigational rights and freedoms. These are cornerstones of global security and prosperity that benefit every country. New Zealand was pleased to co-sponsor Resolution 2817 last month, one of a record number of member states, which reaffirmed the important concepts of freedom of navigation and maritime security. We welcome the continued efforts by Bahrain and the international community to restore safe passage to the Strait of Hormuz. As reaffirmed in Resolution 2817 and by the International Maritime Organization Council, the exercise of navigational rights and freedoms by merchant and commercial vessels in accordance with international law must be respected. We were therefore disappointed that the Council could not adopt the resolution last week. We particularly regret that, in this instance, the 2 permanent members who exercised the veto did so despite extensive efforts by the resolution's proponents to revise the text to accommodate the concerns of member states. New Zealand strongly reiterates the importance of ensuring that all ships and aircraft can exercise their right of transit passage through the Strait of Hormuz without interference in accordance with international law as reflected in UNCLOS. New Zealand remains deeply concerned about this conflict. Civilians and the global economy are being directly affected. It is critical that all parties uphold their commitment to the ceasefire and work to find an urgent diplomatic solution. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of New Zealand. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Australia, followed by Vietnam and Ireland.
Thank you, President. Australia commends Bahrain and our Gulf partners for their efforts in the Security Council to ensure respect for navigational rights and freedoms in the Strait of Hormuz. We're disappointed that vetoes were exercised last week. Navigational rights and freedoms matter for all states. All states benefit from an open Strait of Hormuz and a safe and predictable environment for global supply chains. That's why Australia is participating in discussions on multinational diplomatic efforts to support navigational rights and freedoms. President, the human, security and economic impacts of the Iran conflict are significant and far-reaching. We condemn the indiscriminate attacks inflicted by Iran and its proxies across the Middle East, including against civilians, civilian infrastructure and commercial vessels. We welcome all efforts towards a de-escalation, including the ceasefire announced last week between the United States, Israel and Iran. Australia urges all parties to uphold the ceasefire in full. Negotiations must continue towards a resolution of the conflict, which will support a reopening of the strait. The human cost and global economic impact of this conflict is mounting. The warnings, including this week from the IMF, are dire. We are seeing unprecedented shocks to global energy, fertilizer and petrochemical supplies, with immediate and long-lasting consequences reverberating around the world. In our region, Pacific Island countries are uniquely exposed to price volatility, supply chain disruptions and fuel shortages. More broadly, the World Food Programme has warned that Iran's actions in the Strait could push a further 45 million people into extreme hunger by June. The world's most vulnerable are most at risk. President, the expansion of the conflict into Lebanon, the loss of life and the displacement of more than 1.2 million civilians is deeply distressing. The ceasefire must be extended to Lebanon to prevent further loss of life and to give parties the space needed to negotiate a lasting settlement. President, Australia repeats its call for all parties across the region to uphold international humanitarian law and for civilians to be protected and to cease any attacks that deliberately threaten the safety and security of humanitarian personnel. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Australia. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Vietnam.
Madam President, Vietnam aligns itself with the statement delivered by the Philippines on behalf of ASEAN and wishes to highlight ASEAN's strong interest in the situation in the Middle East, marked by 2 special foreign ministers meeting and the minister's statement. Vietnam remains deeply concerned by the ongoing conflict in the Middle East, including the latest developments in the Strait of Hormuz, which has caused immense human suffering and significant economic consequences. Its impacts extend well beyond the parties directly concerned, disrupting trade and energy supply chains, heightening political and economic uncertainties, and further constraining the development prospects of many countries, especially developing countries. We regret that the Security Council has not been able to take united and impartial actions to address the current crisis and its serious implications for regional peace and security. We strongly oppose the military attacks against sovereign states, particularly attacks against those countries that have declared their non-involvement. We are especially alarmed by and oppose attacks against civilians and civilians' infrastructure. In all circumstances, civilians and critical civilian infrastructure must never be targeted and attacked. Any such attack is in violation of international law and relevant UN resolutions, including Security Council Resolution 2573. This current crisis is yet again a manifestation of the erosion of international law, the continued infringement on the sovereignty and territorial integrity of states, the disrespect for the fundamental principles of no threat or use of force, and principle of peaceful settlement of disputes are in fact endangering the very foundations of the United Nations and our collective security architecture. Vietnam therefore calls on all parties to put an end to hostilities, especially attacks on civilians and critical civilian infrastructure, exercise maximum restraint and avoid actions that could lead to further escalation, miscalculation, and wider confrontation. We underscore the fundamental importance of respect for international law and the UN Charter. We firmly believe that international law must be applied consistently to all states, regardless of size and in all circumstances. Selectivity in the application of international law ultimately undermines international law to the detriment of smaller states. It is Vietnam's view that maritime safety and security, the freedom of navigation and overflight must be upheld in accordance with international law, especially the 1982 United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. This is essential not only for the stability in the Middle East, particularly the Strait of Hormuz, but also for safeguarding the flow of energy and essential goods and preserving global economic stability. Finally, Madam President, the current crisis in the Middle East reminds us once again that only dialogue conducted in good faith and supported by genuine political will can pave the way toward lasting peace. We welcome the temporary ceasefire and encourage parties concerned to build on this momentum, to intensify diplomatic efforts, engage in meaningful dialogue, and pursue a balanced and constructive approach toward a sustainable and mutually acceptable solution. We commend efforts of countries and partners that have worked to maintain channels of communication, facilitate engagement, and create space for diplomacy. Such efforts are indispensable and deserve continued support. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Vietnam. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ireland, followed by Brazil and the United States.
President, Ireland aligns itself with the statement of the European Union. It is deeply regrettable that last week the Security Council was unable to agree a resolution on the critical issue of the closure of the Strait of Hormuz to shipping. We would like to acknowledge the efforts undertaken by Bahrain to reach consensus on this important matter. We remain deeply concerned about the situation in the Middle East, including the continued restrictions on lawful transit passage and the freedom of navigation near and in the Strait of Hormuz. The critical importance of the strait has been clearly demonstrated in recent weeks. While the most immediate impact has been on states in the region, the reverberations have been felt across the world as trade of essential commodities and important supply chains have been severely disrupted. This disruption has a direct humanitarian, security and economic impact across the globe. It is likely that it will impact most heavily on the poorest and most vulnerable communities in relation to both energy and food security and hunger. Such restrictions and acts that threaten safe navigation through the strait are simply unacceptable. We must be clear, maritime security, freedom of navigation and safe transit passage must be respected in line with international law, as reflected in UNCLOS and as affirmed in Security Council Resolution 2817. President, we welcome the recent ceasefire agreed by the United States and Iran, and we commend Pakistan for its mediation efforts. We sincerely hope the dialogue will continue, that progress can be made, and that a lasting agreement can be reached that will bring a permanent end to the conflict and ensure wider regional security. We continue to call for dialogue and diplomacy and for all parties to uphold international law, including the protection of civilians. We remain deeply concerned about the broader humanitarian and security situation in the Middle East. The situation in Lebanon is particularly concerning. We deeply regret that Israel has not extended a ceasefire to Lebanon. We have been clear in our condemnation of both Hezbollah's attacks on Israel and Israel's wholly disproportionate response. We urge Israel to halt its military operations and to allow the Lebanese armed forces to assert their role in providing security for Lebanon and the Lebanese people. We welcome the announcement of discussions between Israel and Lebanon, and we encourage the parties to seek a diplomatic solution. We stridently condemn all attacks against UNIFIL personnel. Finally, we must note our grave concern about the dire humanitarian situation in Gaza. We call on Israel to immediately remove restrictions on aid access and facilitate essential supplies and services to reach people across the Gaza Strip. We are also concerned about the situation in the West Bank, with continuing settlement activity and settler violence against Palestinian communities. Ordinary civilians continue to suffer the consequences of conflict and instability across the Middle East, with spillover effects across the globe. President, in spite of the challenges we face, we continue to believe that the UN and the multilateral system is fundamental to the delivery of peace and security for the Middle East. We hope that the Security Council will return to this matter in due course and provide the impetus for peace, lasting peace across the region. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Ireland. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Brazil.
Madam President, I thank you for convening this meeting. Brazil follows with attention and deep concern the situation in the whole Middle East. The recent escalation constitutes a serious threat to international peace and security, with dramatic humanitarian and economic consequences. Since the beginning of the present conflicts in the region, 2,100 people have lost their lives in Lebanon, 3,400 in Iran, 1,800 in Israel, and a staggering 72,000 confirmed deaths occurred in Gaza. Brazil condemns the attacks undertaken by the United States and Israel against Iran and the unwarranted subsequent attacks by Iran, and appeals to all parties to resume negotiations aiming at reaching a lasting solution for the conflict. The fact that these attacks were carried out once again in the midst of diplomatic conversations to reach an agreement is highly detrimental to the cause of peace and hinders the prospects for a lasting solution. Brazil condemns all attacks and military actions that resulted in civilian casualties, damage to civilian infrastructure, and violations of sovereignty and territorial integrity of states. Such actions are unacceptable and must cease immediately. All parties must strictly comply with international law, in particular international humanitarian law, ensuring the protection of civilians. Military escalation only deepens human suffering and undermines regional stability. The strike on a girls' school in the Iranian city of Minab, which claimed the lives of more than 150 innocent children, warrants the strongest condemnation. Brazil expresses its strong solidarity with the countries and peoples of the Gulf directly affected by the conflict. We also extend our condolences to the families of the victims in all states involved. Moreover, we express concern with the hindrance of innocent passage through the Strait of Hormuz and recall the importance of respecting the right of transit passage in straits in line with the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. We remain gravely concerned by the situation in Lebanon. We urge Israel to immediately halt its military actions and to withdraw all its forces from Lebanese territory. Furthermore, Brazil condemns the attacks against the United Nations Interim Force in Lebanon, UNIFIL, and recalls that attacks against United Nations peacekeeping missions and facilities represent grave violations of international law and international humanitarian law. The United Nations must play a central role in the maintenance of international peace and security, with the Security Council bearing primary responsibility in this regard. At the same time, all member states should support the call for the immediate cessation of hostilities. We must act together to achieve a negotiated solution to the crisis and uphold the principles and purposes of the UN Charter and international law. We reiterate our support for the efforts of regional actors and other relevant partners, including Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Turkey, aimed at promoting de-escalation, dialogue, and diplomatic solutions. We welcome initiatives that point toward a cessation of hostilities across the region and the resumption of negotiations, including for the peaceful reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. We urge all parties to engage in diplomatic efforts and negotiations in good faith to put an end to the ongoing conflicts. Dialogue remains the only viable path to building a sustainable peace. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Brazil. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United States, followed by the United Kingdom and Pakistan.
Thank you, Madam President. Colleagues, we are in a time in history that is a time for choosing. And the American people have been very clear. We stand with, and we have stood with, Bahrain and the rest of the people of the Gulf and our allies in the Middle East during this time of reckoning. Unfortunately, Russia and China have chosen to oppose them, even as Iranian missiles rained down on Gulf cities and civilian infrastructure. Colleagues, the decision of Russia and China to veto a draft resolution that sought to protect freedom of navigation and maritime security in and around the Strait of Hormuz was truly unfortunate. They deliberately chose to turn a blind eye, and worse, chose to permit Iran's attacks on its neighbors, its terror against its own people, and its death grip that it's attempting to place on the global economy. The Council resolution submitted by the Kingdom of Bahrain last week was not unreasonable. They engaged every country on the Security Council. They took their input and their thoughts and reflections on board. It was a simple resolution drafted by and for the region that Iran must stop attacking civilian shipping and the neighboring states in the Gulf and stop threatening its neighbors and stop threatening the freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz. Colleagues, 47 years ago, Iran took Americans hostage as its opening act of its new regime. This year, it's tried to take each of your economies hostage. We are talking about a regime that the Secretary General's own account recruits child soldiers, uses civilian infrastructures for attacks, and goads its proxies, its terrorist proxies, to use human shields on a regular basis. We are talking about a regime which has contravened dozens and dozens of UN resolutions in the last year alone. We are talking about a regime in Iran that promised no more executions and yet has averaged at least one execution per day of young protesters who simply yearn for freedom and a better life. This was after killing 40,000 of its own people in a weekend. Just weeks ago, the Security Council adopted a resolution with 136 co-sponsors, the most supported resolution in UN history, demanding that Iran cease its attacks and stop obstructing shipping, that Iran stop launching missiles and drones into hotels and ports and resorts and airports and attacking its neighbors in their civilian homes and neighborhoods. Yet instead of respecting the will of the overwhelming majority of this body, including many of you sitting right here, and supporting Bahrain and other GCC members, plus Jordan, Russia has chosen to remain, as it has over the past year, a critical supplier of military equipment to Iran, delivering combat aircraft, helicopters, armored vehicles, and other arms, many of which violate Security Council Resolution 1929, which bans arms transfers to Iran. Iran likewise has supplied Russia with hundreds of attack drones and technology for its use in Ukraine. Meanwhile, China has for years imported over 90% of Iran's illicit oil, and both countries persist in their efforts to obstruct the Security Council's work to implement the sanctions measures that were snapped back into place by an overwhelming vote in the Council last September. The measures required all member states of the United Nations to be implementing an arms embargo against Iran, banning the transfer and trade of missile technology, freezing relevant financial assets, measures designed to address the threat posed by Iran's nuclear, missile, and conventional arms programs. All of these things were snapped back into place, and the world is obligated to enforce those measures. As we've noted before, and as I noted in my opening, the world has a time for choosing. There are certainly better partners than this genocidal regime in Iran. We, the United States, have chosen to stand with our Gulf allies, both in the region and here in this body. Instead, others vetoed this resolution and have chosen to shield the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism. Madam President, colleagues, let me reiterate what I said to the Security Council last week. In the days since this draft resolution was vetoed, as critical shipments have been delayed, as fertilizer has failed to reach countries in Africa and South Asia that need it for planting season, as vulnerable populations have faced food insecurity, it is clear who chose obstruction over responsibility. As we speak, humanitarian operations are being disrupted because aid, humanitarian aid, life-saving aid, has not been able to safely transit the strait. So I want to reiterate two simple messages from the United States, from the American people, to the members of this assembly. First, the United States stands firmly with our partners in the Middle East and around the world. Second, the Strait of Hormuz, as are all straits around the world, the Strait of Gibraltar, the Bering Strait, the Straits of Malacca, as international waterways are too vital to be choked, to be mined, to be weaponized, and held hostage by the lights of the Iranian regime. Nevertheless, even in the face of Iran's attempted extortion and obstruction, we will continue to work so that food aid, fertilizer, energy, commercial goods can flow once again through this vital waterway, free from attack, threats, mining, or extortion. And let me be clear, the United States will continue to act with partners whenever possible to ensure that outcome so that the world is ultimately safer, stronger, and more prosperous. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the distinguished representative of the United States. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Madam President. The United Kingdom was grateful to Bahrain for its leadership in bringing forward this draft resolution and for its constructive, good faith efforts to build consensus across the Council on an issue of critical importance to international peace and security. We regret that the draft resolution was vetoed. Madam President, navigational rights and freedoms are a cornerstone of the global economy. Attacks on international shipping in the Gulf have been deeply damaging for the world, blocking vital exports of fertilizer, liquefied natural gas, and jet fuel, with economic and humanitarian consequences for communities the world over. Iran does not have the right to unlawfully impede transit passage through the Strait of Hormuz. We call for full respect for fundamental navigational rights and freedoms as enshrined in the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea and customary international law. We reiterate our condemnation of Iran's reckless attacks against the region. We remain profoundly concerned by Iran's continued destabilizing activities, including threats to maritime security and actions that risk further escalation in an already fragile region. Our priority remains supporting regional stability and a lasting end to this conflict. We welcome the ceasefire and the talks between the US and Iran. We will continue to work with all partners to encourage a lasting and sustainable resolution to the conflict and the full, immediate and unconditional reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, including the rejection of tolls on vessels which seek to pass through. The United Kingdom has already convened more than 40 countries who share our aim to restore navigational rights and freedoms. Tomorrow, the UK and France will co-host a leader-level summit to advance a coordinated, independent, multinational plan to safeguard international shipping when the conflict ends. Russia and China's vetoes do not diminish the importance of this issue, nor our collective responsibility to address it. We will continue to work in the Security Council and beyond to support long-term stability in the region and the maintenance of international peace and security. And I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Portugal, followed by Switzerland and Czechia.
Madam President, Excellencies, Portugal aligns itself with the statement delivered by the European Union and wishes to add the following remarks in its national capacity. As a co-sponsor of the veto initiative, Portugal stressed the need for transparency in the Security Council, use of the veto. We regret that the Security Council was prevented again to act under the current item agenda. Now, for the 14th time in less than 3 years, preventing collective action. These are the first vetoes of the year, yet the veto has been used 24 times since the initiative was adopted by consensus 4 years ago. This trend erodes the Council's credibility and undermines the ability of the United Nations to act. We therefore reaffirm our strong support for the General Assembly as a forum not only for constructive scrutiny, but also for engagement and action for the wider international community when the Council is paralyzed, thereby strengthening the legitimacy of multilateralism and of the UN itself. In the present context, Portugal urges all the relevant parties in this crisis to uphold international law, including international humanitarian law and freedom of navigation. Indeed, while all of us bear the consequences of restrictions on maritime trade in terms of increasing energy prices and constraining food production, accessibility and security, it is yet again the most vulnerable and the ones that can least afford it, namely developing countries that face the heaviest burden. That is why Portugal supported the creation of a dedicated task force within the UN Secretariat at the disposal of member states to facilitate fertilizer trade with a humanitarian perspective. While pleading for the holding of the ceasefire, Portugal strongly supports a solution based on dialogue and diplomacy as the only viable way to achieve a comprehensive and long-lasting peace, including in Lebanon, in order to protect its sovereignty and territorial integrity. In this sense, we commend the efforts of all mediators, notably Pakistan, and we will continue supporting all peace efforts, including, of course, those of the United Nations. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Portugal. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Switzerland.
Madame la Présidente. Madam President, I would like to start by expressing a deep concern on the part of Switzerland regarding the regional situation in the Middle and the Near East. We express our solidarity with all victims and emphasize that any use of force inconsistent with the United Nations Charter is unacceptable. An illegal attack cannot justify a response that would itself violate international law. Switzerland therefore strongly condemns attacks against the civilian population, against essential services and civilian infrastructure. Such attacks are prohibited under international law, international humanitarian law, and all parties to the conflict are required to uphold this law everywhere and under all circumstances. In this regard, we condemn the recent attacks affecting several countries in the region, including Gulf states, targeting essential civilian infrastructure, notably ports and maritime traffic. Water, energy, and fuel supply infrastructure, along with healthcare facilities, have been damaged or destroyed. And here I would like to express our deep solidarity with those countries. This trend to target civilian populations is not limited to the Middle East, but whether in the Middle East, Near East, or elsewhere, the civilian population must be protected. This conflict and the disruption of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz that it causes also have significant repercussions on the humanitarian situation, on supply chains, on energy security, and international trade that extend far beyond the region. We reiterate that the principle of freedom of navigation in international straits is enshrined in customary international law, as well as in the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, and is binding on all states. Switzerland reaffirms the primacy of the peaceful settlement of disputes. We welcome, therefore, the agreed ceasefire and encourage the continuation of constructive dialogue with a view to reaching a lasting agreement. De-escalation and a permanent ceasefire for the entire region remain imperative. Madam President, the member states of the United Nations have entrusted the Security Council with a primary responsibility for maintaining international peace and security. And in discharging these duties, the Security Council must act in accordance with the purposes and principles of the United Nations. And this responsibility calls for a unified response. The veto is not intended to be a right to obstruct, but a responsibility for final decision-making exercised in the name of international peace and within the framework of shared responsibility. In this context, Switzerland always regrets the exercise of the veto. We reiterate that negotiations within the Council must be conducted in good faith and oriented towards common objectives in accordance with the principles of the UN Charter. We call on all Council members to demonstrate the political will that is needed for the Council to fulfill its mandate and to work towards a return to diplomacy. And if the Council cannot discharge its responsibility, it is up to this General Assembly to consider the situation and, if need be, to act. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Switzerland. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Czechia, followed by Canada and Germany.
Madam President, first of all, I'd like to state that the Czech Republic aligns itself with the statement delivered by the European Union. Madam President, the Czech Republic welcomes this opportunity to discuss the recent use of the veto in the Security Council. We have consistently supported the veto initiative, which gives the General Assembly an important opportunity to scrutinize the use of the veto and to hold Council members accountable for the exercise of this exceptional power. Such a prerogative must never be beyond political and moral scrutiny. This is precisely why we are here today. On the 7th of April, the Security Council failed to respond to a serious threat to regional stability and international maritime commerce. Not one, but 2 vetoes were cast. Russia and China chose to protect their ally, Iran, rather than support a measured and necessary response to growing dangers in the Strait of Hormuz. The draft resolution tabled by Bahrain, together with Jordan, Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, sought to encourage coordinated defensive efforts to protect commercial shipping in the Strait of Hormuz. It was a modest, practical, and responsible proposal. Bahrain and its regional partners consulted seriously and thoroughly with all members of the Council, took views on board, and pursued a balanced and focused text. We supported Bahrain's initiative and deeply regret that the resolution was not adopted. Dear colleagues, we cannot ignore the scale of the threat that the current Iranian regime poses to its neighbors and to its own people. For 47 years, Iran has pursued policies that have undermined peace and security across the region. It has armed terrorist proxies, targeted civilians, threatened its neighbors, breached nuclear commitments, disrupted shipping lanes, and destabilized governments. At the same time, we all want to see tensions in the Strait of Hormuz de-escalate. We therefore welcome the diplomatic efforts currently underway and stress the importance of full respect for international law, including the law of the sea, as reflected in the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. We also commend the UN Secretary General's decision to establish a UNOPS-led task force aimed at ensuring humanitarian flows through the Strait of Hormuz. This is vital to mitigating risks to global food security and ultimately to protecting the most vulnerable. Madam President, the veto power is an extraordinary responsibility. On the 7th of April, however, we witnessed not restraint, but its reckless misuse. It did nothing to advance the Council's core mission of maintaining international peace and security. Instead, it deepened instability and uncertainty in the region and beyond. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Czechia. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Canada.
Thank you, Madam President. Canada wishes to express its sincere recognition to the Kingdom of Bahrain for their leadership at the UN Security Council, representing several states of the Gulf, as well as Jordan, in efforts to protect the freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz. Canada was happy to be one of the 136 co-sponsors of Resolution 2817 of the Security Council, which condemns Iran's attacks on states of the Gulf and Jordan, calls for a cessation of hostilities, and reaffirms support to sovereignty, to the protection of civilians, and to freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz. Canada was therefore disappointed that the Security Council was ultimately unable to reach an agreement on the draft resolution S/2026/273 pertaining to the Strait of Hormuz. This outcome is not in sync with Canada's expectations vis-à-vis the Council's duty to act decisively given imminent threats to international peace and security, pursuant to the mandate provided to it by the United Nations Charter. Canada remains resolved to support diplomacy and dialogue so as to reach a lasting solution to the conflict and to avoid any further escalation. We will continue to support our allies and partners in the region, as well as efforts geared towards preserving the safety and security of maritime and air navigation.
President, we thank Pakistan and all the others involved in their work to facilitate recent negotiations and a ceasefire. Canada welcomes the current ceasefire, but a temporary pause is not a permanent solution. Canada reaffirms the importance of respecting international navigation rights in the Strait of Hormuz and surrounding waterways, and the safety of the seafarers whose livelihoods depend on open sea lanes. Canada is also taking concrete action. We are contributing 23.6 million barrels of oil to the International Energy Agency's collective release to stabilize global energy markets. Looking ahead, Canada is prepared to play its part in the design of an international approach to de-escalate tensions and to provide guarantees of safe passage for this essential and strategic corridor. Canada will continue to support efforts to build the broadest possible international consensus, including through the General Assembly, to uphold respect for international navigation rights as well as international law. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Canada. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Germany, followed by Italy and Malaysia.
Madam President, Germany aligns itself fully with the statement that has been delivered by the European Union this morning, and I would like to add a few additional points in my national capacity. Germany deplores that the draft resolution that was submitted by Bahrain was not adopted due to vetoes of 2 permanent members of the Security Council. The resolution would have been an important contribution for ensuring freedom of navigation and maritime security in the Strait of Hormuz. In addition, it would have sent a clear signal to Iran that it must not instrumentalize the freedom of navigation for political purposes or harm third countries. We highly appreciate Bahrain's dedicated leadership and flexibility during the negotiations, in particular by emphasizing measures of de-escalation and the necessity to abide by international law. It is thus deplorable that 2 vetoes squandered an important opportunity to contribute to overcoming a situation that affects many of the countries assembled in this building today. And I want to be clear, Iran's attacks against countries of the Gulf Cooperation Council and other countries in the region are unjustified, and they are unlawful. And the targeting of civilian infrastructure is particularly unacceptable. Iranian attacks in the Strait of Hormuz and the Persian Gulf constitute a violation of international law as reflected in the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. These violations of the freedom of navigation affect trade, they threaten economies, supply chains, as well as energy and food security around the globe, and ultimately they particularly hurt the most vulnerable amongst us. Madam President, Germany remains convinced that only a political solution can bring lasting peace to the region. We welcome the direct talks between the United States and Iran that started in Islamabad, and we thank Pakistan for its mediation efforts. Germany remains ready to work towards a comprehensive political solution. Iran must never acquire a nuclear weapon. It must respect its obligations under the NPT and its comprehensive safeguard agreement with the IAEA. And Iran must urgently ensure maritime security, freedom of navigation, and the free, safe, and toll-free passage in the Strait of the Hormuz and adjacent seas in line with its obligations under international law. The Security Council must not be paralyzed when regional stability and international peace and security are at stake. For our part, Germany, we will continue to support diplomacy, de-escalation, and a negotiated solution. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Germany. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Italy.
Your Excellency, Madam President, dear colleagues, Italy aligns itself with the statement delivered by the European Union and wishes to add some remarks on its national capacity. Italy thanks Pakistan and the other regional partners for their efforts to facilitate talks on the situation in the Gulf region. There is no alternative to dialogue. We always said that diplomacy is the only way, and we hope new talks will take place soon towards a substantive negotiated settlement and that the ceasefire is respected, including in Lebanon. Deputy Prime Minister and the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Italy, Antonio Tajani, visited Beirut on Monday to express solidarity and support to President Aoun and Lebanese institutions at this critical time. We must avoid other civilian casualties and encourage dialogue. In this regard, we welcome the announcement a few minutes ago of a ceasefire in Lebanon and hope all parties will uphold it. Italy is very worried for the situation in the Strait of Hormuz. What happened has serious consequences for the global economy and for food security in the most fragile countries. When the environment will be conducive, we are in favor of appropriate efforts to contribute to ensuring freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz. Italy is also very concerned for the impact on relations between Iran and the other Gulf countries. It is crucial to rebuild trust. Italy is always ready to do its part for peace and stability, and to this end, we remain in close contact with all partners involved. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Italy. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Malaysia, followed by Indonesia and Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Madam President. Malaysia aligns itself with the statement delivered by the Philippines on behalf of ASEAN. Malaysia is deeply concerned over the recent escalation of military actions and retaliatory strikes across the Middle East. These developments threaten regional stability and run counter to the principles of sovereignty, territorial integrity, and the prohibition on the use of force under the UN Charter. We call on all parties to exercise maximum restraint and hostilities and avoid any further escalation. We acknowledge the restraint shown by member states of the Gulf Cooperation Council. Such restraint is critical to ongoing efforts toward de-escalation of tensions. Malaysia further stresses that responses to the conflict must be even-handed and avoid selective attribution of responsibility. Peace cannot be built on double standard. It can only be built on fairness, consistency, and respect for international law. Above all, the root causes of this conflict must be addressed. Without this, we will only continue to manage symptoms while the crisis deepens beneath the surface. Madam President, Malaysia is also deeply disturbed by the continued military attacks by Israel on Lebanon. These actions constitute serious violations of international law and directly undermine sovereignty as well as the territorial integrity of Lebanon. We condemn the attacks on UNIFIL peacekeepers in southern Lebanon, which have caused death and injuries, as well as damages to UNIFIL assets. These are not just attacks on a mission, but on the very principles of peacekeeping and the UN itself. Those responsible for the attacks must be held accountable. In this challenging time, however, we see a window for diplomacy. Malaysia welcomes the temporary ceasefire paving the way for negotiations between the United States and the Islamic Republic of Iran. This pause creates space for dialogue and mediation toward a more lasting solution. We also take note of emerging proposals that could serve as a basis of engagement. They must now be translated into a comprehensive peace agreement. Malaysia therefore urges all parties to fully respect and implement the ceasefire in good faith and abide by international law. Any provocative action now risks unraveling fragile progress with consequences not only for the region but for global economic and energy stability. We commend all diplomatic and mediation efforts, including the constructive engagement by Pakistan. Malaysia remains ready to support all efforts to advance peace and stability in the region. We also call for unimpeded humanitarian access to all affected civilian populations. Malaysia reaffirms the importance of freedom of navigation and the security of critical maritime routes in accordance with international law. Madam President, the situation once again exposes a troubling reality. The Security Council is not functioning as it should in the face of crisis. Whether in Gaza, Lebanon, or the wider Middle East, the Council has too often been unable to act decisively when it is most needed. This debate under General Assembly Resolution 76/262, or the Veto Initiative, provides an important platform for member states to deliberate on matters affecting international peace and security and to uphold the principles of transparency and accountability. Malaysia therefore reiterates its long-standing call for reform of the veto with a view to its eventual abolition. A reformed, expanded, and more representative Security Council would be better equipped to discharge its responsibilities under the Charter effectively and credibly. To conclude, Madam President, Malaysia urges all parties to return to the most basic principles that bind us as a global community: respect for international law, the UN Charter, international humanitarian law, and the protection of civilians above all. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Malaysia. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Indonesia.
Madam President, Indonesia fully aligns with the statement made by the Philippines on behalf of ASEAN. Today, once again, the Security Council's credibility is being tested. Once again, the Council is falling short of its mandate to maintain international peace and security. Specifically this time, it is about safeguarding strategic maritime corridors that underpin global supply chains and addressing the humanitarian consequences that follow. Madam President, the consequences of this war are felt across the region and beyond. The impact is immediate and severe. Therefore, we encourage and support the Secretary General to establish special mechanism as an interim measure to ensure the flow of traffic for critical commodities such as fertilizer, oil and gas, to mitigate food and energy insecurity in many countries. Madam President, with goods, oil and gas, people also pass through these waters. Seafarers of all nations now face growing risks, with about 20,000 are stranded at sea. We call for all parties to ensure the safety of seafarers and ships in accordance with the International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea and the relevant standard and recommended practices by the International Maritime Organization. The sea is a global common good. It is in our collective interest to safeguard it, including its regime of transit passage. Indonesia therefore calls on all states to exercise maximum restraint, prevent further escalation, and act in full conformity with international law, including in particular the 1982 UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. We firmly believe that sustained engagement and credible negotiation remain the only viable path to ending this war. Going forward, Indonesia underscores the urgency of littoral states and key countries to develop confidence-building measures that can ensure the continued security and stability of maritime routes in the Strait of Hormuz. Madam President, lastly, our meeting today must not become just another procedural exercise. It must catalyze the Security Council to act decisively to deliver tangible progress on the ground and to undertake long overdue reform so that it can effectively fulfill its mandate. Only through action can we restore stability and protect humanity for the region and beyond. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Indonesia. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Republic of Korea, followed by Thailand and Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Madam President. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the most vital maritime corridors in the world, through which a significant portion of global energy supplies transit daily. It is also a vital channel for exports of fertilizer from the Middle East, as about 1/3 of the world's fertilizer trade normally passes through this strait. Therefore, any disruptions to its safety and security carries profound implications, not only for the region, but also for the stability of our interconnected global economy and society, as we witnessed recently. Against this perilous backdrop, my delegation notes with regret that the members of the Security Council fail to bridge their differences on this issue despite the urgency and importance of the situation. The Republic of Korea calls on the Council to take appropriate action to ensure transit passage and freedom of navigation in the Strait, and to continue their efforts to take collective measures to uphold the Council's primary responsibility for the peace and security by close and constructive consultations. My delegation also hopes that failure to adopt the resolution will not send a wrong message that threatens to navigational rights and freedom can be justified or be used as a weapon in any warfare. Madam President, my government would like to reiterate the importance of the following 3 points. First, freedom of navigation is a fundamental principle of international law, as reflected in the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, and must be respected at all times. The principle is sacrosanct for ensuring the uninterrupted flow of global trade and energy. We express grave concern on threats and attacks on vessels, and underscores that no country should be able to decide which ships or cargoes may pass through the strait or impose charges. We would like to reaffirm that the status of the Strait of Hormuz as an international waterway, where all ships and aircraft enjoy the right of transit passage. In this regard, my government is ready to join international efforts with our partner countries to safeguard the principle of freedom of navigation. Second, My delegation would like to underscore that only dialogue, diplomacy, and good faith engagement can lead to a sustainable and peaceful solution. The ongoing peace talks among parties should continue until an agreement be finally reached. At the same time, any durable ceasefire must be fully respected. In this connection, we commend the continued efforts of the mediators, particularly Pakistan, as the host of recent peace talks, for their constructive role in facilitating dialogue and de-escalation. We also highly commend the Gulf countries for exercising restraint from engaging in the conflict, despite Iran's direct attacks. In the same spirit, my delegation highly appreciates the tireless efforts of the Secretary General, including the engagement of his personal envoy, Zhang Arno, who continues to consult closely with key stakeholders in the Middle East. Third, we emphasize the importance of the strengthened international cooperation to safeguard maritime security. This includes enhanced information sharing, confidence building measures, and coordinate responses for the safety at sea. Madam President, the stability of the Strait of Hormuz is not just a regional matter. It is a global imperative that requires our collective responsibility. My government remains firmly committed to working with all member states to promote peace, stability, and secure safety of international sea lanes and freedom of navigation. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Republic of Korea. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Thailand.
I wish to thank Madam President for convening this meeting on such an urgent and extremely important matter. Thailand fully aligns itself with the ASEAN statement delivered by the Philippines and would like to make the following statement in our national capacity. Madam President, we share the profound concern of the international community over the situation in the Middle East. A prolonged conflict, while inflicting immense suffering on innocent civilians on the ground, carries serious and far-reaching repercussions, not only for regional stability, but also for global security, energy markets, and the world economy. Disruptions in the Strait of Hormuz directly threaten critical global energy supply chains and disproportionately affect energy importing countries, including, of course, Thailand. While not a party to the conflict, Thailand is directly affected by its consequences. A Thai-flagged commercial vessel was struck in the Strait of Hormuz, with 23 Thai crew members badly affected, while other vessels remain stranded. We therefore call on all parties to respect freedom of navigation and the right of safe transit passage in accordance with international law, including, in particular, the 1982 UNCLOS. The safety and security of civilians and seafarers must remain a priority. We also underscore the obligations of all parties to protect civilians and civilian infrastructure in full compliance with international humanitarian law. Madam President, Thailand welcomes the two-week ceasefire between the United States and the Islamic Republic of Iran. We commend the mediation efforts of the Islamic Republic of Pakistan and all parties involved. It is a positive step, yet it remains extremely fragile. Without full and effective implementation of the ceasefire and sustained dialogue in good faith, peace will remain elusive and civilian suffering will, of course, persist. In closing, Thailand calls on all parties to respect principles of international law, including the Charter of the United Nations, exercise the utmost restraint, immediately de-escalate tensions, and return to dialogue, diplomacy, and negotiations towards a comprehensive and lasting resolution. I thank you for your kind attention.
I thank the distinguished representative of Thailand. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Sierra Leone, followed by South Africa and Pakistan.
Madam President, I thank you for convening this debate on the use of the veto in accordance with General Assembly Resolution 76/262. On 28 February, our world was confronted with yet another instance of the use of force not in conformity with the Charter of the United Nations and international law. The subsequent developments have not only undermined the Charter's prohibition on the use of force and the parameters governing the exercise of the inherent right of self-defense, but have also raised serious concerns regarding compliance with international humanitarian law in the conduct of hostilities. In response to this development, the Security Council has considered the ongoing hostilities in the Middle East and led to the adoption of Resolution 2817, which Sierra Leone co-sponsored. Subsequently, on 7 April 2026, the Council also considered a draft resolution under the agenda item, the situation in the Middle East, proposed by Bahrain and the Gulf Cooperation Council. 11 Council members voted in favor, while 2 permanent members cast negative votes and 2 members abstained. As a result, the draft resolution was not adopted, and we have taken note of the explanations of vote delivered by those member states that cast non-concurring votes. While we regret that the text was not adopted, particularly given the aim of halting attacks and threats against merchant and commercial vessels in and around the Strait of Hormuz, we nevertheless hope that the current ceasefire will be extended and that the root causes of the conflict will be addressed in order to secure lasting peace and stability in the region. We therefore commend Pakistan for their continued mediation effort, and we also commend the efforts of the UN Secretary General and relevant UN agencies. Madam President, the debate provides Member States with an important opportunity to reflect on the impact of the veto on the functioning, credibility and effectiveness of the Security Council in discharging its mandate. It also compels us to consider the real consequences of Council's paralysis on the lives and livelihoods of people affected by the conflict directly and indirectly. For Africa and for Sierra Leone in particular, the economic impacts of the current conflict are already consequential. The conflict has triggered a trade shock and is rapidly evolving into a cost of living crisis, driven by higher fuel and food prices, rising shipping and insurance costs, exchange rate pressures, and tighter fiscal conditions. The fertilizer shortage may prove even more consequential than the oil shock, as disruption to liquefied natural gas supplies has affected ammonia and urea production during a critical planting season in many parts of Africa. For Sierra Leone, if the conflict persists, war risk insurance premiums will rise sharply, vessels will continue to divert via the Cape of Good Hope, and the cost of essential imports, including fuel, food, pharmaceutical, construction materials, and industrial input, will increase significantly. If these trends continue beyond June 2026, good projection is that growth could slow sharply, inflation could rise again, fiscal pressures could deepen, and more of our people could be pushed into extreme poverty. In light of the foregoing, Sierra Leone calls on the involved parties to exercise maximum restraint and to pursue dialogue and the peaceful settlement of dispute in accordance with Article 33 of the Charter of the United Nations. We underscore the fundamental importance of respect for the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of all states, as well as strict adherence to the prohibition on the use of force as enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations. Finally, Madam President, there is no doubt that the Security Council must be reformed to reflect present-day geopolitical realities. The question of the veto remains one of the 5 clusters under our discussions in the intergovernmental negotiations, And it is our sincere hope that as Member States, we will reach agreement to address the structural injustice and the responsible use of the veto, for greater power comes with greater responsibility. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Sierra Leone. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of South Africa.
Madam President, we meet today in accordance with the automatic requirement of the General Assembly Resolution 76262 to convene when the veto is used in the Security Council. South Africa appreciates the opportunity for the General Assembly to consider this unprovoked and destructive conflict in the Middle East, where war is severely impeding the development agendas of targeted states. We recall that on 28 February, the current conflict began with a breach of Article 2.4 of the UN Charter. Considering the conflict's incalculable threat to international peace and security and its impact on the global economy, the use of the veto prevented an even further escalation of the conflict that would have solicited more states to become involved, resulting in further devastating political, economic, and social consequences for the entire world. Madam President, South Africa welcomes current initiatives as well as the ongoing efforts aimed at achieving a comprehensive end to the conflict in the Middle East and advancing a just, sustainable, and lasting peace. An immediate cessation of all attacks and threats of attack, as well as strict compliance for such undertakings, is imperative to prevent the future recurrence of such aggressions. Respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the affected countries in the region must be respected by all parties concerned. In accordance with international human rights and international humanitarian law, civilian populations and civilian infrastructure must never be targeted or attacked by any party under any circumstances. South Africa urges all parties to return urgently and in good faith to dialogue and inclusive negotiations, and reaffirms its support for credible, impartial mediation efforts aimed at bringing an end to the conflict and securing a durable and just peace for all the countries in the region. South Africa is equally alarmed by Israel's continued illegal, indiscriminate military operations in Lebanon, which have resulted in civilian casualties, the destruction of essential infrastructure, the displacement of communities, and the death of UN peacekeepers. These attacks constitute a serious breach of Lebanon's sovereignty and territorial integrity, and further destabilizes the region, compounding an already volatile and fragile situation. The killing of peacekeepers deployed by our organization by a fellow member state can never be condoned. South Africa is equally concerned by responses by Iran against several Gulf countries, which can also be considered a violation of the UN Charter. While Iran has the legal and moral right to defend itself against those states that engaged in armed attacks against it, its actions against the Gulf Cooperation Council states should be in accordance with Article 51 of the UN Charter and not violate the sovereignty of the affected states. These attacks against the GCC states heighten the risk of a broader regional conflagration. While we note the adoption of UN Security Council Resolution 2817, which strongly condemns Iran's military attacks on civilians and infrastructure in GCC countries and Jordan, We are disappointed that at the time the Council was unable to call for and guarantee an immediate ceasefire and the commencement of diplomatic efforts towards a peaceful, negotiated settlement. It is the core duty and responsibility of the UN Security Council to ensure peace and the pacific settlement of disputes, and not to decontextualize and escalate a crisis. South Africa believes that the international community has a shared responsibility to uphold the principles of freedom of navigation and to ensure the safe passage of vessels. We urge all parties to work towards a peaceful resolution of the conflict and to respect international law. In this respect, we urge all parties to exercise maximum restraint and to ensure that any actions taken are fully consistent with international law. Related developments pose systemic risks for countries like South Africa that depend on stable international legal regimes and frameworks, including the International Maritime Organization and the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. The increasing normalization of coercive maritime practices outside multilateral structures could erode global norms that safeguard freedom of navigation. Madam President, the Security Council must take lessons from the ill-conceived use of force in Libya, not respecting the letter and spirit of Resolution 1973. The broad nature of the present failed draft would have been even more unclear on the permissibility of the use of force, thus opening the door for possible abuse or misinterpretation. Madam President, South Africa remains steadfast in its belief that there is no military solution to this crisis. All parties must prioritize de-escalation, avoid further confrontation, and pursue diplomatic negotiations in good faith, preferably through established multilateral mechanisms under the auspices of the United Nations. Despite the commendable attempts by Pakistan to broker peace, the trust deficit as a result of Iran being attacked twice in the midst of negotiations seems insurmountable without sufficient guarantees. South Africa echoes the call of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights for all states to uphold international human rights and humanitarian law, and to act in a manner consistent with the principles of our shared humanity. We believe that the Strait of Hormuz is a vital international shipping route for goods and energy and should not be blocked by any party to this conflict. South Africa calls for the restoration of normal passage through the strait as the situation is adversely impacting countries around the world. Madam President, the choice of war appears to have become a default despite our collective undertaking consistent with the obligations in the UN Charter not to use war as a means to resolve our differences. We should not ignore rising threats of a further act of aggression against another member state, the island state of Cuba. Illegal acts of aggression against Cuba can only compound the already devastating effects of the decades of old blockade. In conclusion, South Africa reiterates the importance of making real and meaningful progress towards peace rather than contributing towards further divisiveness. We reaffirm our position that the parties to the current conflict should begin to identify areas of common interest in a spirit of compromise and flexibility, rather than continue to go down a path of destruction. There can be no victor in this war of choice, as the cost for the parties, the region, and the international community have already been far too grave. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of South Africa. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Pakistan followed by Tunisia and Morocco.
Madam President, Pakistan's clear and unequivocal position on the situation in the Middle East has been expressed in the Security Council and elsewhere. Pakistan remains deeply concerned at the developments over the past weeks in the region. This conflict, whose consequences have impacted everyone in the region and beyond, should never have happened. From the outset, Pakistan prioritized de-escalation, cessation of hostilities, and return to dialogue for a peaceful diplomatic solution to this crisis. Pakistan successfully hosted the Islamabad talks on 11th and 12th of April. These talks were made possible by Pakistan's engagement with the parties, as well as outreach efforts aimed at promoting immediate cessation of hostilities and achieving peace and stability in the region. And through the Islamabad process, Pakistan is pursuing the objective of ending the war and ensuring long-term peace. Pakistan supports the sovereignty, territorial integrity, political independence and security of all brotherly countries in the region. Pakistan has also expressed continued and unwavering support and complete solidarity with the fraternal GCC countries in these challenging times. Madam President, the Strait of Hormuz is an important international shipping route for goods and energy. Pakistan calls for the security of ships and crew members and the swift and safe passage of civilian ships and restoration of normal passage through the strait. The situation in the Strait of Hormuz is adversely impacting countries around the world, including Pakistan. The consequences for regional and global economy are evidently harsh, and Pakistanis are also suffering. The impact is felt not only in terms of energy flows, but also fertilizers and other essential commodities, thus affecting food security, cost of living, and squeezing the livelihood of the most vulnerable. IMF, for example, has warned of serious risks, raising alarms about the rise in public debt as countries around the world respond to the energy crisis. And this was a headline on the front page of today's New York Times. Interestingly, another headline on the same page referred to the stock market scaling a new peak, reflecting optimism that peace was near. This is just one perspective outside these halls as the international community follows this crisis. The options are therefore clear. If the military escalation and disruptions persist, the suffering will prolong and extend far beyond the region, translating into widespread economic hardship. Return to peace, on the other hand, will benefit all. Madam President, we agree on the urgency of the situation and the fundamental objective of reopening of the Strait of Hormuz and normalization of the situation at the earliest. This is an important issue not only for the GCC countries, but also for all states in the region and beyond, including Pakistan. It is also logical that any discussion or arrangement related to the Strait of Hormuz will have to take into account the legitimate interests of the GCC countries in accordance with international law. We are grateful and humbled that Pakistan has been recognized for its constructive diplomatic engagement in supporting the de-escalation, the ceasefire efforts, and the broader pursuit of stability between the United States and Iran. Through sustained interaction, including at the leadership level with both Washington and Tehran, as well as with other partners in the region and beyond, notably Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Turkey, and China, and others. Islamabad has sought to encourage dialogue, facilitate the exchange of messages, and help create conditions and space conducive to meaningful negotiations. This approach underscores Pakistan's consistent commitment to regional stability and international peace, reflecting our preference for principled, dialogue-oriented diplomacy in addressing complex geopolitical challenges and managing complex disputes. Madam President, Pakistan remains committed to continue playing its constructive role in promoting dialogue, fostering understanding, and supporting all efforts aimed at achieving lasting peace in the region. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Pakistan. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Tunisia, followed by Morocco, as the last speaker before our break at 1.
Your Excellencies, Tunisia reaffirms its total solidarity with our brothers in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the Kingdom of Bahrain, the State of Kuwait, the State of Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, the Sultanate of Oman, the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, and the Republic of Iraq, while confronting all threats to their security, stability, sovereignty, and prosperity. Now, based on the constant principles of its foreign policy, Tunisia stresses its commitment to respecting all states' sovereignty, UN Charter, and rule of law, and the primacy of peaceful means in the settlement of disputes. The current tragic situation, threatening today the stability and peace of the entire world, is a direct consequence of the international community's failure to restore the imprescriptible rights of the Palestinian people on all their land, as it is a direct consequence of an unprecedented moral, ethical, and human worldwide scandal, predatory attitude, and personal agendas not sufficiently denounced and clearly condemned. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Tunisia. Now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Morocco.
Madame la Présidente.
Madam President, there are times where history calls upon nations to rise up and defend what they believe in. Today, the Kingdom of Morocco defends the values that the founding fathers of our organization enshrined in the Charter: national sovereignty of states, territorial integrity, and collective security. These values are today being tested. The security of our brotherly Arab countries has been violated. The capacity of the multilateral system to respond with a single voice to the challenges in front of us is also being tested. It is in this context that the Kingdom of Morocco would like to reaffirm its three principal positions. First of all, the Kingdom of Morocco condemns in the strongest possible terms the abject Iranian aggression using missiles, which violated the integrity and security of the brotherly countries Saudi Arabia, UAE, the Kingdom of Bahrain, the State of Qatar, the State of Kuwait, and the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan and the Sultanate of Oman. We consider this to be a flagrant violation of national sovereignty of these states, an inadmissible attack on their security, and a direct threat to the stability and security not just of the region, but of the world as a whole. Secondly, the Kingdom of Morocco welcomes the announcement of a ceasefire between the United States and the Islamic Republic of Iran. We support the facilitation provided and much appreciated provided by Pakistan to these negotiations. Thirdly, the Strait of Hormuz is a strategic artery, and its central role for the global economy and the stability of international trade is universally acknowledged. We underscore the importance of making sure that the Strait safeguards its role that it's playing for prosperity and stability of all nations. Madam President, some things are confirmed with time. During the summit in Morocco in 2016, His Majesty Mohammed VI, may Lord protect him, reaffirmed that Morocco is always considered that the security and stability of the Gulf Arab states is inextricably linked to the stability of the Kingdom of Morocco. What damages you also affects us, and what impacts us also impacts you. End of quote. And following this royal vision, we reaffirm our full solidarity with the Arab states in the Gulf and its full support to all of the legitimate measures who they will deem necessary to preserve their security, ensure the safety of their nationals and residents on their soil. To conclude, Madam President, I would like to say that the peace in the region of the Gulf is a peace for the world entire. Peace which is the most precious heritage that we can bequeath to future generations. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Morocco. We have heard the last speaker in this debate for this meeting. We shall hear the remaining speakers this afternoon at 3 p.m. in this hall. The meeting is adjourned.